And as I said, Hilde is leaving for Texas, so we have to have her speak now. And she's a well-known speaker here in Norway. She's spoken at the Peace Institute for NRK in multiple places in the media.
Thanks for inviting me, guys. I have been asked to talk about the election, polarization, all the things. And then I'm also hoping that you guys will tell me stuff. I'm here for selfish reasons to collect data from American voters to tell me things. Although at this point, have you all lived in Norway for a long time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So good, because my PowerPoint is in Norwegian and I'll speak in English. And that way you'll get to practice your excellent language skills. So I am going to talk about two things. I'm quickly going to talk about what I call the American paradox, which is also my book. And then I'm going to quickly segue into talking about politics today and polarization, so-called, and especially asymmetrical polarization, which I think is more important. So we're going to get sort of nerdy and political sciencey, since that is my day job. Okay. So I've already talked to Democrats abroad about my book. I think that was last year. 22. Oh yeah, midterm. Always call when there's an election or coming around the bend. Which is also, this book came out right before the midterms. And how many were here and heard me talk about my book? Oh, good. So there won't be, for 2 slides, there won't be that much, too much bored audience. So I was asked to write like a textbook about the American political system. You know, this is how federalism works. This is how the Supreme Court works, which is super boring, and nobody likes boring textbooks. So instead, I kind of wrote a book where I try to explain the development of the American political system from sort of start until today in a more engaging way, and trying to think of all the questions I always get when I give lectures in Norway from Norwegians who have a lot of questions about the American political system, because it is very confusing. And in order to do so, I called the book The American Paradox and kind of used it as a key for understanding American political development. So what I mean by the American paradox is simply that the US was founded as a paradox. It was founded both as a liberal republic based on Enlightenment ideals and institutions. And then it was also founded on slavery and on ethnic cleansing and all of these things that some governors don't want us to talk about. And so the way that I start the book is that I talk about how the attempt at trying to solve that paradox is a big part of understanding American political development and the institutions that go along with it, that links up to voting rights and links up to gerrymandering. It links up to so many things. So for me, the way I understand American political history is that if you have the first founding, that's a kind of a paradox, then the Civil War can be viewed as a second founding, the first attempt at solving the paradox, right? Because you have these unsolved, really foundational disagreements about what kind of political entity the US is supposed to be, what kind of political institutions there should be, and who they should be for. And so the Civil War, as some historians view it, can be seen as a second founding or a second attempt at a founding, because once the troops, the Republican troops, withdraw from the South, Reconstruction kind of comes to a halt and a kind of backlash comes in. And so the second founding isn't really all that successful, right? You have some really important progress in the 3 amendments. You have voting rights for Black men, right? Citizenship for all Black Americans, kind of important amendments. But then after the 1877, you start having a backlash and you start having a retrenchment and let's say, a rise of the white South again, which then sort of challenges the second founding, which is why a way of thinking of the civil rights movement is as a kind of a third founding, or an attempt at a third founding. Like this time, we're actually really going to finally agree on what the rules are for the American political system, for participation and for representation, which there still was no agreement on since the first founding. And I like to put in the phrase, the leader of the free world, because the civil rights movement is also bound up with World War II and the kind of image that the United States was portraying, or was fashioning for itself, what it was fighting for, what it was fighting against. But it was fighting with segregated troops. You have these incredible stories of Black soldiers coming back from Europe and talking about how wonderfully they were treated in Germany, and then they're not allowed to vote when they come back, right? So the civil rights movement can be sort of, if you see it this way, another attempt at solving the paradox. And you get, whereas after the Civil War, you get these really important amendments, with the civil rights movement, you get not really any amendments, but you get a lot of important laws and reforms. And one of the laws that I like to point out is the Voting Rights Act, right, of 1965, because it's kind of the law that is there to finally realize the promise that has been there the whole time of equal rights, equal voting rights for all, not just in theory, not just in Enlightenment philosophy, not just in a constitutional amendment that then is not enforced, but in actual fact on the ground. And one of the things that the Voting Rights Act does is that it allows the federal Justice Department to come in and actually supervise states that in 1965 have discriminatory voting practices in order to check that they are not doing any funny business, which becomes really important for our later story. But one of the things that happens as if the third founding is ongoing, and as the Democratic Party, because we saw the picture here, is of Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King, right? And so the Democratic Party becomes kind of associated with civil rights. It becomes the party that pushes for civil rights and equal rights. And as that happens, a really, really important development starts around the middle of the 20th century that has a huge impact on politics today, which is the resorting of the parties, because white Southern voters start to leave the Democratic Party. So white Southerners are the red triangles. And in 1950, white Southerners are a huge share of the Democratic Party, right? And then you see the red triangles go down and down and down and down and down, and it goes all the way past 2000. And what we see is that you have a fundamental resorting of the two political parties, where the Democratic Party in the middle of the 20th century was a party not only of, but a very, very important group was white Southerners, right? As that voting group switches over into the Republican Party, step by step, slowly, first in some presidential elections, and then also further down the line in congressional elections as well, you get a fundamental reordering of the two political parties. And as Black and other minority voters are allowed to actually use their voting right because of the Voting Rights Act, they enter into the Democratic Party. And so you get two parties that by the year 2000 look really, really different from what they did before. And that is part of the story and part of what we're going to talk about today. Now, I just want to mention a really important little part of this story is that, so in 1965, the Voting Rights Act removed all the hindrances for minority voters to use their voting rights, and also put federal enforcement behind that. And it took until 2008 before you had almost as high voter participation among Black voters as white voters. So in 2008, the voting participation among Black voters almost reached that of white voters. So it took 50 years, right? But it actually worked in the end. 2008, you almost have as many Black voters as white voters, voter share. And of course, we know that that's the year the US gets its first, and so far only, non-white president. Now, while Obama was president, something really, really interesting happened. And this is something I talk a little bit about in the book, which is that the Voting Rights Act was challenged in the Supreme Court. And that was a kind of a historic event, because from 65 up until 2013, it's Congress that reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act. And they do so bipartisanly, with support from both parties, because there's a sort of general consensus after the civil rights era that we are now all for voting rights for everybody, not just white voters. And it would be kind of embarrassing to say that we're not for that. So we're going to keep reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, Shelby County is a district in Alabama, and they then have sued the federal Justice Department, saying that they think it's unfair that the federal Justice Department is supposed to supervise Shelby County just because, and I'm simplifying, but just because we were racist in 1965 doesn't mean we're racist anymore. So we should be able to decide our own voting rules and procedures, and we shouldn't have to check with the Justice Department before we make changes. And in a historic decision, the 5 conservative justices on the court agreed with Shelby County, Alabama. So what that meant was that after, or as of 2013, there was no longer the case. There was a part of the Voting Rights Act called Section 5, which was now invalidated. So the Supreme Court, they didn't invalidate all of the Voting Rights Act, but they invalidated Section 5, which meant that the Justice Department would no longer go in and check and pre-clear and organize and keep tabs on these voting districts. Now, the first presidential election after this was 2016. And what we see is that states that are run by the Republican Party, I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here probably, but states that are run by the Republican Party since 2013 have been very eagerly taking advantage of the absence of Section 5 and changing voting rules, procedures, all kinds of things, sort of like where you'll put voting booths, how long they'll be open, what kind of rules you need for ID. There's lots of things that states can do that you all know very well, that can affect how easy it is or how difficult it is to use your voting right. And we see that since 2013, Republican states are changing rules in a way that make it harder in general to use your voting rights, whereas Democratic states are going in the opposite direction. Now, into this environment, with the first Black president, with a weakened Voting Rights Act, Donald Trump walks in 2015. And I think one of the reasons I was very, very sure that Trump would never get the Republican nomination in 2016 was because he was breaking all of the sort of unspoken rules that had been circumscribing public discourse on some very important issues, such as race, since the civil rights era, right? There were certain things you don't say. There's certain way you're supposed to speak about different groups, religions, minorities. And he sort of broke all the rules. He talked about Americans and America as if the definition of Americans in America were white Christians. He used Islam as a kind of enemy. He said that Islam, the religion, was an enemy of the United States. So not terrorism or radical Islamist groups, but the religion Islam. His audience was a group of people that historically have been the group of people in the US that has the most political power and influence, right? But that were feeling that they were losing this political power and this influence. White men. And in 2016, there was this huge debate because the support for Trump was very surprising, given that he was breaking all these rules and saying these things that you were not supposed to say. There was a puzzle, right? The puzzle is, okay, but why are people supporting him if he's saying things that we all agreed were not okay to say? And there was a big debate about, oh, these are probably voters that are worried about the economy. They're economically precarious, which was also part of the debate around Bernie Sanders's candidacy, right, in 2016. Now, what political scientists found, however, was that the factor that had Trump voters stand out was not necessarily any kind of economic precarity or necessarily any worry about the economy. It was that they had what political scientists call white vulnerability. So a feeling that white Americans are under threat. And so Make America Great Again, I think, is a pretty perfect motto for that group. Because when you ask Trump voters about the motto, Make America Great Again, you ask, so when was America great? When are we going back to? And the answer is the 1950s. And then that means, so that's pre-third founding then, right? It's pre-civil rights. We're back to the 1950s. That's when the United States was great. Incidentally, also when white Christians ruled America. Which leads us to this issue of polarization. Because this is a word I see absolutely everywhere. Do you guys feel like you hear this all the time when people talk about American politics? So polarization is just, that's just two poles moving away from each other, right? It's from the hard sciences, which I'm very bad at, but I do know this. It's just poles moving away from each other. Which of course, which I talk about in the book, in which you guys know very well because you're Americans. That's not how the American political system is made. It's not made for parties that are polarized, that are far away from each other, right? In fact, as you all know, founding fathers didn't want political parties, didn't think there would be political parties, didn't design a system where you would have these very different parties that didn't want to cooperate, right? The idea was always cooperation and consensus and working. I think their idea was honorable men working for the best of the nation. And then things went a little bit awry. So institutionally, if you have two parties that are far away from each other in a two-party system in the US, you have gridlock. That's not going to work. But I'm going to come back to this. So when people say polarization, there, I think, could be many different but related phenomena that they're talking about. And there are some structural factors that have contributed to polarization in the US. One is increased economic inequality over the last 3-4 decades now, which I'm going to come back to each of these points. Increased diversity, right? And then social or geographic polarization. I'm going to go through these. So this is a graph that shows income inequality and one way of measuring polarization in the House of Representatives. And the blue line is economic inequality, and the red line is polarization in the House of Representatives. And they do overlap quite nicely. As inequality rises, polarization seems to rise. Okay. Increased diversity. So the US now has the highest percentage of foreign-born Americans than it's ever had in its history. So the last time the US had almost 15% of its population born abroad was around the turn of the century, when all these Scandinavians had come and all these Eastern Europeans had come, and white Protestant Americans were freaking out, which led to the 1924 Immigration Act, if you guys have heard of that, which was an immigration act that had as its goal to preserve a white Christian majority in the US, preferably Protestant. Because for a long time, if you were Catholic in the US, you weren't counted as white. Same with Jewish, but that has changed. In 1965, now we're back in the Civil Rights era, Congress revised the Immigration Act. There was a huge reform. Senator Ted Kennedy worked on it. Lots of senators worked on it because they recognized that the 1924 Immigration Act was quite racist. And so they reformed the immigration law and changed it so that it would allow for more immigration from non-European countries. Now, probably the people who worked on that law did not intend for the effect to be so drastic as it has been, but the effect has been to allow for a lot of immigration from especially Latin America and Asian countries. And today, you now have, so the highest point before was 14.8% foreign-born, and now we're above 15 after the census. So in terms of a changing demographic reality in the US, that is real, and you can see it in the statistic. And while Obama was president, while the US had its first non-white president, the census came out with a projection saying, not a projection, with a statement saying there, as of now, I think this was 2013, white Christians are no longer a majority in the US. Not white people, but white Christians, which is both related to immigration, but it's also related to a rise in secularism, because now more people, including white people, say they're not religious, right? So anyway, the group traditionally that has held the political power in the US, white Christians, while the first Black president was in office, were now no longer a majority. Okay. All of this, I promise, it'll all come together. So what we're seeing, one of the things that I think people mean when they talk about polarization is they're talking about social polarization. So social polarization is the phenomenon where your social identity increasingly overlaps with your political identity. So what's a social identity? It's your gender, it's your level of education, your ethnicity, whether you're urban or rural, right? And what we're seeing is that in the US today, if you're young, you're a woman, you have a college degree, and you live in a city, it is very, very likely that you vote Democrat. If you're a man, you're a Christian, you live in rural area, and you maybe don't have a college degree, it is very, very, very likely that you vote for the Republican Party. And that was not always the case, right? You guys probably remember a time when that was not the case. It is the case today. And so this overlap of social and political identity is called social polarization. And it creates what one political scientist called these mega identities, because they all fit together and there's no overlap with other kinds of people, with other kinds of opinions. So there's less interaction between these groups. And this also happens to be the case geographically, because apparently Americans, to an increasing degree, now move to or live in areas where people look like them and think like them. So you have a geographic and social polarization where there's just less interaction between these groups. So perhaps before you'd meet Republicans in your church and now you don't anymore. That would be an effect of social polarization. This became really, really clear in 2016 because the Trump-Clinton race really crystallized some of these developments that had not been so clear before. For instance, this issue of education. Now we're all very aware of voters, whether they have higher education or they don't. That was not such a big deal before 2016. That didn't correlate with voting Democrat or Republican. But now, as of 2016, non-college voters, to a large degree, vote Republican. Non-white voters, to a large degree, vote Democrat. So you have sort of all of these different aspects of voters that are clustering together, making for two parties that are very, very different in their profiles. This is perhaps why political psychologists are talking about affective or emotional polarization. Because I think a lot of times when journalists talk about polarization, what they're talking about is the anger and the sort of rancor and the hysterics, which is not about content. That's not about ideology. It's about the level of affect in political discourse and our private lives around the Thanksgiving table, for example. And so there's a thesis then, it's an argument that you're seeing a rise in affective polarization, i.e. stronger antipathy against the other, and stronger feeling of identifying with your group, the in-group, because you have the social polarization now. So you don't know so many, I gotta stay calm. So you don't know so many people, right, from the other group. You don't talk to them anymore. You don't see them. They're not your neighbors. So it's easier to feel scared of them, to get a little bit more emotional. To now you have people answering surveys saying they don't want their sons and daughters to marry someone from the other party, which people didn't used to maybe think so much about before. So you have different indicators of different kinds of polarization. And you just don't have anymore so many sort of cross-cutting identities and issue positions where you might have before. So you're getting sort of pure identities and pure political positions. There's this wonderful researcher called Liliana Mason. She's written a book on this. So those who have aligned religious, racial, and partisan identities react more emotionally to information that threatens their partisan identities or issue stances, because it all goes together now. Okay. That leads me to my final point today, because I've talked about emotions, social identity, geography, economic inequality. But what I think is the key, or at least really important, is ideology. So what about the content, the political issue positions of the two parties? Are they polarized? And my argument is that from the 90s until today, the Republican Party has steadily moved to the right ideologically, whereas the Democrats are sort of, running around over here as they always do. But they haven't moved the same extent to the left that the Republicans have moved to the right. So if you want to talk about political or ideological polarization, it doesn't make sense to call it polarization unless you label it as asymmetrical. Preaching to the choir, probably. But there are some good reasons for why this may have happened. So there, as I mentioned earlier with that sorting graph, so the Republican Party, as the United States, I'm going to hurt this thing. I'm going to ruin the furniture. As the United States has gotten way more diverse, we saw the graphs, the Republican Party is becoming more homogenous to an extent. There's an asterisk to that. But it's becoming, to an increasing degree, a party for white Christians and white older Christians and white male older Christians. And at the same time, and these groups overlap, it's become much more a party for conservative Christians, right? Which have, from the 70s until today, step by step become more important to the party, and then to a certain extent taken over the party. So the ideological positions of the Republican Party, especially on what used to be called culture war issues, which today is called identity politics issues, has gone quite far to the right. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has politicians that can have quite leftist views, but the party as a whole has not changed so much on cultural issues as a party, as the politicians that you find in Congress or in the White House. So the Republican Party has become more ideologically right-wing, but the Democratic Party is a party of lots of different factions and groups that have a hard time agreeing with themselves. So more socially conservative Black voters, more liberal white college degree voters, right? So you have these factions that are still negotiating with each other. Whereas the Republican Party, to an increasing degree, it is internally coherent and consistent, and so it's dragging itself to the right. And so I think a big part of what ails American politics is not polarization, because that concept is too vague, and there are too many kinds of polarization. But in terms of what ails politics, it's asymmetrical polarization. And here we see that the percentage of non-centrists in the two parties is not symmetrical, right? The percentage of non-centrists in the Republicans has increased dramatically, whereas in the Democratic Party, it stays more or less the same. I think this all has a lot to do with a kind of panic on the right about who their country is for and what kind of, how to sort of define America and Americans. And I think this loss of position among white Christians is an important part of the story. I think it's an important part of the story for why the Republican Party is not just becoming more right-wing, but it's becoming actually radical and anti-democratic. As the Republican Party loses numbers, it wants to hold on to power and positions to a degree that makes it do things that are not democratic or not following the rules or the rule of law in order to hold on to political power. So this guy, therefore, when he ran in 2020, I think Biden was very, very clear the way that he sort of framed the election. He was talking sort of about the paradox. He was sort of saying the Trump and the new Republican Party, they represent this faction throughout American history that lost. They lost in all the foundings, they lost. And now they're back and they want to re-argue their case. So battle for the soul of the nation, right? And he seems to have this very strong belief that yet again, there will be a solution and that the right people will win. But there's an asymmetry, not just in ideology, but also in the political reality these days, because one of the things that is, I think, a really important part of the story is that the media universe in the US is also not symmetrical. So if you want to talk about asymmetrical ideological polarization, I think you can also talk about asymmetrical media universes, right? So the ecosystem on the right is not like the ecosystem on the left. You can have, I think there's a really important difference between media that is run by editors, that is fact-checked, that follow certain rules, and media that doesn't. And what you find on the right is that it's more ideology and less fact-checking, and also more coordination with the Republican Party. So following Fox News in 2016 was really fascinating, Because at first, Fox News followed the Republican Party and was very skeptical of Donald Trump because the elite in the Republican Party did not want Donald Trump. We forget maybe, but there was a time when they said they didn't want him. And so Fox News was quite skeptical, taking their cues from the Republican Party elite. But as that changed, as Trump took over and got the nomination, Fox News changed completely. And so having, I can't even talk about Tucker Carlson, having a kind of media ecosystem that is a kind of a wing of a political party is, of course, a huge help. And the Democratic Party doesn't have this to the same extent. Maybe you can look at MSNBC and you can see some of those things, but not, there's just no comparison between sort of the ecosystems. And of course, the really, really unfortunate part of Donald Trump is that he also brought with him not just sort of right-wing websites and actors and media personalities, but extremist websites and blogs and groups that actually call for political violence. So the Republican Party today, I'm quite comfortable calling them a liberal right-wing radical party. We all know the reasons why. And importantly, and this is very typical for authoritarian parties, you see also a sort of systematic cleaning out of those in the party who are critical of the new Republican Party, of the Trump wing of the Republican Party. So Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, who were in the January 6th commission, of course, are not in Congress anymore because the party doesn't want them. And I think part of this election is about, for the Republican Party, whether this is the sort of final takeover of that more radical wing of the party. And I think I don't know that he has to win the election for that to be true. I think it already happened. They renominated Donald Trump. To me, that is good enough evidence that the Republican Party today has been sort of successfully taken over by a very right-wing fraction. And interestingly, it seems that a lot of the time what the Republican Party is talking about these days is kind of what they used to accuse Democrats of talking about. It's a lot of culture war stuff going on. It's a lot of identity politics. There's a lot of focusing on textbooks in schools, that they're not patriotic enough, that they're not teaching American kids to be proud of American history. Ron DeSantis in Florida thought he would get the Republican nomination by sort of making Florida into a showcase for new Republican policies, talking about critical race theory and how teachers are teaching kids to hate America, which didn't work because Republican voters don't want people who are like Trump. They want Trump himself. We've really seen that come through. But of course, when a political party goes to extremes and start promoting quite extreme policies, then you get to a point where they're outside of the norm or mainstream in terms of what a majority of American voters want. So I think the Dobbs decision is a good example. The Dobbs decision was not popular. It does not represent a majority of American voters, right? But it was a decision that was possible because Republicans in Congress and Trump in the White House have become quite extreme and are now nominating very extreme judges. But so when news media, for instance, write that abortion is a polarizing issue in the United States, I don't think that that's true. We see that a majority of Americans are for legal abortion, a federal right to abortion, not a free-for-all, but a right to abortion. And that has been steady. It's been steady. It's been a majority. It's been steady for a long time. That's not really necessarily all that polarizing. I mean, very, very few we're down to 13% say that they think abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. But that's a policy that you're now seeing effectively being instituted in several states. And so you have policies now coming out of the Republican Party that are outside of the mainstream, that do not have majority backing. But because they are ideologically extreme, they still push for these policies. Now, of course, Democrats are hoping that that means they'll win the election. I think there is a good case to be made that the Dobbs decision basically won Democrats the midterm, right? And so I think Biden is pretty much banking on repeating that success, making sure to mobilize on this issue because he sees that he gets a lot of voters. And all these Republican states that are now passing all these extreme laws are, of course, helping Biden, helping his campaign. And the Republicans as a party also are not united on abortion. We see that a lot of Republicans are comfortable with what's going on. We see that it's not necessarily popular in their own party, depending on how you define the party. So this is a real gamble that some very right-wing extreme actors are going ahead with now. However, so the Democratic Party, until 2018, was not known for being, close your ears, Christina, very organized, disciplined, or unified. I'm sorry to say. Still not? Well, the thing is, 2018, 2020, 2022, it was like the Democrats were the Republicans, really focused on the one goal of defeating Donald Trump, Republican, and having success, having electoral success with this, really closing ranks. But now, with Biden's support for Israel, we see that there's an opening on the left now, where a lot of people are really angry with Biden's support for Israel, which seems to be opening up for being angry about other things, being critical of other things. And we see that. We saw that in the nomination elections, right? In Michigan and Minnesota, like significant percentages voting uncommitted or something else that state would allow them. We have an uncommitted in the back.
Democrats abroad, same.
Okay, what did you allow?
Huge percentage of non-committed.
What percentage of Democrats abroad voted uncommitted?
Christina, you correct me. I think it was somewhere between 12 and 20, which was pretty high.
Between 12 and 20. That's very
I
high.
actually thought it was even higher,
Yeah. So that's, of course,
which was kind of frightening.
yes. So Joe Biden can't win in November if leftists stay home or don't organize on his behalf, as they have been doing before. So in this moment, that's a real, I'm not sure that banking on abortion is going to win in November if this remains so unresolved and unpopular as we're seeing that it is. So unfortunately, we are living in extremely interesting times. And it's becoming a trite thing to say now, but 2020 was a incredibly important election in American political history. 2022 was, 2024 will also be a really important election in American political history, where I think what you guys are doing is once again trying to refound your country. And it's still sort of unclear who's going to win. Read my book. Thank you.
So we can open up for questions now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Andy?
As before a question, I just wanted to give you a comment. First of all, thank you so much. But I'm sure you've heard the old Will Rogers bromide where he used to say, I'm not a member of any organized political organization. I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot has changed, but we somehow often manage to succeed in spite of ourselves. But thank you.
Democrats have succeeded in spite of themselves, was the comment in the back. Yes.
I want to explore this issue of the nature of the right-wing traveling Republicans, the kind of right-wing extremism, MAGA idealism which exists. There are the cultural issues which you outlined, they've taken up, which are very right-wing. They're extremely anti-woke, whatever that means to them. But some writers I've read, though I didn't read this carefully enough, but some writers said that MAGA Republicans and their leader, the Trump leader, do not want to pull the government completely out of society. They're not libertarians. They don't want the government to have social welfare programs which deal with poor people and minorities. But they do want the government to support the causes, including the economic causes, which they support. So it's not like they're approaching the libertarian stance with reference to government involvement. They just want to change it.
Yeah, so the welfare state aspects of MAGA ideology is, I think, very similar to the kind of right-wing parties you see in Europe, which are pro-welfare state for the in-group, but not for the out-group, which has been, so the old sort of left-right divide has been sort of withering for decades. And part of that withering is that these right-wing political actors and parties are not libertarians, as you say. It's completely correct, because we know that the Christian conservatives are very comfortable having the state very much up in your business.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, this was part of the Tea Party. This was the sort of confusion surrounding the Tea Party. It's not that they were against their own welfare arrangements, but they were against certain other groups getting for instance, healthcare. And so thinking about it as the traditional left-right divide is not helpful. And I agree with you.
There's also the unfortunate issue of inflation and the cost of living. And although Biden has done a good job in the macro economy for the long term, when you look at the statistics of how sort of middle-class America is living, 25% can't pay their medical bills, 50% are close to going bankrupt. And rightly or wrongly, unfortunately, they blame whoever's in for that. An old politician once said, I can do well, but if the price of hamburger is going up on election day, my chances are not so good. So I think that in some ways, Biden has not acknowledged that. In other words, I see him when he goes into coffee shops and whatever, we have the best damn economy in the world. And these people can't pay their bills. So they say, well, he must be demented. And I think it would be helpful if he would at least acknowledge the fact that the economic shoe is pinching, ordinary Americans. So like in New Hampshire, you have, which is pretty much where I'm from, it is basically a state that can go either Democrat or Republican. And they're more or less the same, actually. They are economically conservative and socially liberal. They don't want a nutcase like Trump, but they also don't want somebody that's spending too much money. So you have 45% of the Republican voters that voted for Nikki Haley. And that's a big number. I mean, in the past, if, say, Trump is a sitting president going for re-election, that's the end of the story. You either drop out like Johnson and Truman, or you get defeated like Bush Sr. So
Yeah.
What are those Nikki Haley people going to do? Are they going to vote? It's the old Jack Benny story: your money or your life. Are they going to vote for the nutcase so they don't get the economic liberal, or are they going to vote for the economic liberal not to have the nutcase? That'll be the interesting one.
I have a suggestion from what I read today. I think it was in the Washington Post. They might vote for Robert Kennedy Jr. Instead, they don't want to vote for a Democrat. No, but they're not going to vote for Trump. if they're going to vote for Kennedy.
So the comment is about the state of the economy and how important that is for voters, and that Biden isn't doing a good job of talking to people's. I mean, it's inflation is high. Going to the U.S. now as a Norwegian sucks for several reasons. It's really expensive. I completely see that, and also, I mean, there's this on top of the decades-long increased economic inequality, right? Although it's really interesting to see the different groups and how they have reacted to this, right? Because you don't have working class voters are not just working class voters, right? Some people vote for Biden and some people vote for Trump. But I agree with you that he has incredibly strong headwinds. He has 39% approval rating now. It's been that way for a long time. That with inflation would mean in any other historical era, no chance at re-election at all, unless a lot of these Nikki Haley voters vote for him. And so, of course, Biden's problem is he needs these leftists, but he needs the Nikki Haley voters. And it's hard to find a policy that where they are both going to agree, but he really needs them. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a bit of a change, but I hope it follows your theme of developing what has really been, and I agree, a recurring attempt by the United States to find itself. But I've read since at least 2017, 18, these Ballotpedia analysis of the so-called 206 counties. These are the counties that voted for Obama twice, and yet voted for Trump in 2016. They are a mystery, and I've never seen anyone thoroughly analyze them, but they're still being carefully watched because they inevitably turn out to be swing counties. Do you have any, are you familiar with that? Or
so the switchers from Obama to Trump, yeah, it's sort of a mystery, but then political scientists have to remember that voters aren't necessarily as interested in ideological consistency as political scientists are. But one convincing explanation I have heard is that Trump also appealed to people who were really sick of the system and who thought that he might change some fundamental things that they didn't like. And the Obama years were hard. There was a recession and there was still a war on terror. The amount of change promised was not cashed in on, right? Well, he promised a lot. And so an outsider who was going to change everything could have been very appealing to lots of different kinds of voters if you turned one deaf ear to certain rhetoric, right?
yeah, that falls in line with Bernie Sanders' popularity.
Yes.
Well, and why many
Yes.
of us thought he might have been able to carry it. But the 206 counties creates dilemma for those of us who think, well, it's strictly along racial lines, or it's strictly along this line or that line, because that flies in the face. People who voted twice for the first non-white president were not racist fundamentally. So there was something going on, and there, I think, still is something going on. I have some theories, but I won't get into that right now. But
We have somebody's hand up online. Rick,
Oh, sorry.
Rick has a question.
Yes.
You want to unmute, Rick?
Oh, yeah. You
Gotta
got it.
unmute myself here. So,
Yes.
how are you doing?
Good.
So, as usual, I agree with 50% of what you say and disagree with 50%. But so, as a Republican, I just have to throw in there the Nikki Haley voters are not going to anybody else but Trump. That's just a given. That's like saying that the Kennedy voters are going to go to Trump rather than go to Biden. Interesting. But a lot of talk has been what's happened historically up to now. What's more fascinating, I think, or something to be considered at least, is what's going on from the last couple of years going forward. And some fascinating trends have been happening. And one, Black voters vacating the Democrat Party, and Hispanics as well, which has been pretty significant. And I'll refer to a 2023 Washington Post article that referred to that. And so the edge has been taken off what has been historically a very Democrat advantage in the political election cycle. So that no longer exists to the degree that it was, and how much that is going to influence the upcoming election remains to be seen. So my question to you is, what do you think this trend of the traditional basis of the Democrat Party moving away, now whether they're going to move to Trump or something else or stay independent, who knows, but moving away because they feel like apparently they feel like their needs are not being addressed within whatever environment they are. And I mean, one of the things that Trump said was, hey, vote for me. These people haven't helped you for 50 years, so what have you got to lose? That seems to ring true with a lot of voters. And just, what are your thoughts? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I don't think we can't say that Black voters are leaving the Democratic Party. That would be a crazy exaggeration. But Trump improved some with Black men a little bit and Latino men, especially without higher education. So again, we see that education is really important. But the trend line, if we extend it back, is I think that many, or not a majority, but a significant portion of Latino voters were likely to vote Republican, especially in the Bush years, right? He did a big job to attract Latino voters. So they moved away from the Republican Party, and now some of them are coming back, possibly, although we have to wait for the election to see the numbers. But yeah, in Florida and Texas, that's definitely, I think, much more among Latinos than Black voters. But that's something that's important to keep an eye on, because small margins will matter a lot. Now, Biden in 2020, to an extent, so a few things changed. He got more white men to vote for him than Clinton did, which helped him. But Trump got a little bit, some women back again from 2016. So there are some things that are fluxing back and forth a little bit along the margins, but these margins really matter. And the Latino voters, and I think especially some Black men, is something that I think the Democrats are really worried about. So it's going to be really important. You're right.
Yeah, the traditional ideological lines are starting to get a little blurred these days.
Yeah, 100%. Trump not having an ideology might be a part of that.
I have a question that deals with media. I find it so ironic that they can outright lie on some of these news channels that you see in the United States. There's the Fox News, and the last time we were there, there's that other new channel. What's the name of it? I can't remember. But I mean, they say outlandish things. And these Christian right people, I mean, why don't they realize that there is a commandment that says you shall not bear false witness? And it's like, that just doesn't make any difference that they can just say these things.
I think this is a philosophical discussion of what people believe and why they believe them. It's hard for me to have, I don't have an answer on this.
But I mean, that's partly what's caused the problem. All these falsehoods that they've been spreading.
I mean, 2016, I actually did a seminar with the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler, who did all of the fact checking in 2016. And he was exhausted because just statistically, there are two different universes. There are all other presidential candidates and Donald Trump. They're just in different universes in terms of how many lies and what kind of lies. That was sort of Steve Bannon's motto, right? Flood the zone with shit. I mean, there's a little bit of a new era now, where there isn't that kind of, there's no sort of shame attached to lying, and there's no consequences for lying in one party. In the other party, there is. And this is an asymmetry.
But it used to be against the law to have slander.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing that I'm really concerned about, and you touched on it too, that is the level of education and the amount of people that are taking higher education. Because like obviously, as you're saying, so much of this is fake news. And comparatively speaking, what I see in like, for example, here in Norway, where there's a very strong focus on critical thinking. And if people are not taking the higher education in America, then what is happening? And then we're going to be moving so many more people over to the that will abide the messages, for example, of what's happening in the Republican now. But do you know, I'm thinking, being born and raised in the 50s, it was very common, obviously, that people took a college education. Do you know how the changes have been in the last 50 years?
Well, there was a massive increase in people who went into higher education in the 60s and 70s, right?
Exactly, after Sputnik.
Yeah.
Where they put a lot of emphasis and the resources into higher education.
So the role of higher education, of course, now it's becoming increasingly unaffordable for many people, which is a huge problem. I agree that one of the most important things we do in higher education is teach critical thinking and also how to be critical of sources and know what's good information and what's bad information, which is a really important skill these days, which is my plug for the liberal arts. But so this sort of Republican war on higher education, on campuses, on textbooks that are critical to American history, I think it's part of the story. And I think it's really dangerous because you need to have an educated electorate that can discern good information from bad information. Which is why, to me, it seems very smart for a liberal democracy to invest in higher education. You may want to get on it.
Higher education is important, but it's not the end all, because you have a country like Norway where not everybody has higher education, but the people here are the one Norwegian word that I like. It's called dannet, to know how to behave. And it's pretty much the Norwegians know how to behave. And one of my best examples of that is there was a janitor that took in some small community, took a school board and sued the school board because he felt that his job was in jeopardy because they were not fixing the roof. And he won that court case. A janitor in the United States would never even conceive of the fact that he could take the school board to court. So it's the way it goes through the society. It's not just about higher education. I'm not implying that a janitor doesn't have a higher education. Could be that he does, but I mean, you have people here that are tradesmen that are very informed about what's going on. And I don't know why the United States has that discrepancy, because it's not. Higher education is important, but it's not the end.
Of course.
Wait, I'm going to just shoot something in right there, because since I am an educator.
Right.
And the point is that with the new curriculum that has come out, they're starting in elementary school with critical thinking, and definitely in the middle school. So that's what I'm thinking is, so I mean, it's like maybe not everybody needs to take a higher education,
right.
But I mean, it's to get into putting that into the curriculum as early as possible.
Could not agree more.
Because it's not rocket science, I mean, it's definitely.
Yeah, just quickly in response to that, I think the Republican assault on trade unionism in the States in the last 50 years has been very successful. The numbers speak for themselves. And for me, that's a fundamental difference, whether it's the janitor's story in terms of having an educated electorate and many, many, many other things. But I wanted to ask you, at what point do you want us to tell you how we can help you further with your work? You mentioned that at the outset.
Tell me everything you know. All of you. No, I'm just kidding.
We're afraid.
Yeah.
We're mostly afraid because we see the possibility that Biden could lose this election.
Yes.
And the alternative is bleak.
Sorry, yes.
Well, it depends. Most of us have a lot of experience, and I would venture to say all of us here are extremely well-read. But if you're interested in what we can give you in terms of our experiences with voters trying to cast their ballot from abroad, for me, it's been an amazing education, and it's quite terrifying. Your comments about how the states can change the rules, I had no clue until I started calling voters and talking to them personally, just trying to answer fundamental questions. And fortunately, I don't even do that. We have experts. We need trained experts to stay up to date, volunteers who can help people get their ballot in the box. It's beyond belief how difficult and how expensive it can be when you're calling people and asking them if they can still spend €100 because they've run out of time to get their ballot back by mail. This is just a small window into the world we see. Now, for me, the big question is, to what extent do we make a difference? And that's a big imponderable. We were told in 2020 we actually made the difference in Georgia and in Arizona because the margins were so small. And that's become pretty much gospel. Christina, you can correct me.
Yeah,
on that.
the Senate, we would not have the majority in the Senate if we
Well, the
did not
Senate,
have
I'm not
the
sure.
overseas.
The Senate, I'm not so sure, but I definitely know the
Georgia.
presidential. I know there were the 2 Georgia Senate seats that we worked on.
Yeah.
But one of the curious things for me at this very moment is the DNC doesn't seem to recognize our importance. They haven't given us any money. So we're raising our own money to call voters in the states and making the calls ourselves. So that tells me, following the money, that somebody doesn't think we make that big a difference, or they're just not paying attention. But these, if you want more information, I'm sure we could sit down with you for hours and give you our experiences. But whether, I don't know who has the hard data. We do have people who have some really fascinating data.
And that's very cool because people never talk about the votes that come from abroad, almost never. But it's an actual significant amount.
Right,
It
there's
is.
even
It's
argument.
an untapped amount that even we're not sure of.
Mhm.
As recently as last month, we got new analyses that were inconclusive because the data was kind of flimsy from the federal voting assistance program, which is different from our data bank, and then we have the state data banks. But we've heard everything from 2 million to 7 million Americans abroad.
9 million.
Yeah, and so it's a mystery to us, but to the extent you really want more information, I'm sure among us, we can put you in touch with people.
That's great. I would really appreciate that. And I want, can I ask you, I see we're way over time, so I'm so sorry we're going to end, but can I ask one question for you guys? Because I've always wondered about something, because you said that Norwegians are donnet.
Yeah.
That's not normally how we're known.
Yeah.
But
The generation that I,
yeah,
in comparison to.
well, the way we think of Americans is you guys are extremely polite and very kind, right? So Brits are polite, but they're not necessarily so kind. And Americans are kind and polite. And I lived in Virginia for 7 years and really felt that that was true. And so this image of sort of the nasty, the angry, the insulting Americans that we see, I don't recognize that. Can you guys solve this mystery for me?
Depends upon where you
Or am I
are.
asking the wrong party? Yes.
I will say that there are other societies besides the US where people are in their day-to-day activities polite and want to avoid conflict and want to smooth things over, but they are also in certain situations murderous toward each other. So it's not just the US where you find this kind of Dr.
No.
Jekyll and Mr. Hyde effect.
I think it's I think on the individual basis, it's true. I mean, people are a lot easier to sort of be with and whatnot. But there's something that happens, that's been happening in the group mentality, like the little town in New Hampshire that I was in for 40 years. Was, didn't matter if you were Democrat or Republican. I was actually the equivalent of the mayor of the town, and I was a Democrat. Nobody cared. Most people were Republicans. But now when I go back there, I talk to my friends, and they say, well, there's Facebook groups in the town that have formed that are very polarized. So that you no longer feel like you're it's only a town of 5,000 or 6,000 people, and pretty well educated actually, but also farmers and whatnot. So they say the whole feeling of the town when people are in groups is completely different, and that on some level it has also affected individual interactions.
Yeah,
So it may be social media
which is an
is a
important
problem.
part. It's an important part of the story,
Yeah.
of course. Absolutely.
Now, we haven't even touched on money in politics.
Yeah.
I mean, Citizens United was probably the worst thing that ever happened in the United States.
Controversial decision. Very controversial decision. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. We're totally over time. I should have actually just not given a lecture and just asked you guys questions.
I think you did a very good
You
job.
should set that up.
Yes, I would love that. That would be great. We're going to do it, Christina.
Okay.